there is this sort of problem where you just have these infinite options available to you. And I would advise, with all those options in front of you, the most important thing is just really go within yourself and find your own voice. Really think hard about what your own voice is, what you are bringing to the world, what is your history, what is your story, and try to, as much as possible, to like realize that you're navigating this world of infinite options, but what is going to be most important and valuable is for you to stay true to your own voice. And you got to look at it sort of like navigating that narrow path and trying to go to where you truly want to go, and not getting distracted, because it's like even within part of electronic music production, like let's say like bass sounds, for instance, there's this infinity of bass sounds, and you ask producers like, what do you use for bass? You just get a million different answers of like, oh dude, you got to use this synth, and you got to use this effect, and you got to do this and that, and you need like 10 layers on top of it and stuff. It's just like you're faced with all these options, but you just have to like sort of, with all that in front of you, like, what sound am I hearing? What is really serving like my music and my voice?
You're listening to the Freio Music Podcast.
To the Freio Music
Podcast.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Scott Sterling, and I make music as Drumspyder, and I am a percussionist and sort of fusion folktronica producer.
Where are you from, where are you based out of right now?
Berkeley, California.
Were you born there?
No, I'm originally from the East Coast. I grew up in Winchester, Massachusetts, near Boston.
Nice. Well, Berkeley seems like a very like a cultural nexus point. What drove you to Berkeley, or what made you land there?
I have been on the West Coast for a while. I went to college in Oregon and to grad school in Southern California, San Diego. And so I have just kind of shifted over to the West Coast, and after grad school, I decided to be a musician, an artist, and just moved up the coast a little bit. And I've been here ever since, and it's a good home base here. I'm actually sort of quiet and reclusive in my hometown here, and most of my gigs are traveling out of town.
What did you study in school, out of curiosity?
Philosophy.
Nice.
Yeah.
So that was your major?
I was pretty set on an academic career at one time, but that was a long time ago.
Where did you study in Oregon?
Reed College.
Okay. Nice. I studied also philosophy in the University of Oregon, so just wasn't sure if we were going to land in the same school, but that's an interesting path. So philosophy, and then did you go to postgrad for that same field?
Yeah. Yeah, that was at UC San Diego.
Were you thinking at that time that you were going to be teaching this, or what?
Yeah, I was at a PhD program, but I dropped out like halfway through with the master's degree, and came up to the Bay Area. It was an interesting time. There's a lot of, at least back then, there's a lot of cognitive science and philosophy of science and neuroscience philosophy intersections going on there, and it was quite interesting. I have departed a long way from academic philosophy and that sort of view of the world, but still it was good in some ways. And I also kept up my music. I played in an industrial band when I was there.
What's an industrial band?
Well, industrial music is, I think it's kind of a bygone term, but it's a kind of a form of somewhat raucous avant-garde music where it involves a lot of using kind of found metal objects for percussion and various experimental sounds. And at that time, it was one of the first times I had encountered electronic music production, actually. The guy who was at the center of this band in San Diego had like a very early computer music setup. And I just remember how he could barely fit 3 tracks at a time on a desktop computer. Like everything was so much more rudimentary compared to the technology we have now. But it was really interesting to see. That was the first time I'd ever seen someone really using synthesizers and producing music on a computer and doing all the kind of things that are standard music production now.
How old were you at that time?
I was in my early 20s.
Okay. And what first got you into music? Did you pick up an instrument, or did somebody in your family encourage it?
Yes. My grandmother played the piano, loved classical music. I tried a couple instruments early in school, but I first took to the piano, and I took piano lessons. And I loved classical music when I was a kid. But then the first instrument I really clicked in with was the drum set. And sort of late high school, early college, I started playing drums and just in various bands. And I've always been self-taught on the drums. I never really started with any lessons. And so, I just started experimenting and finding my way and playing in bands through college, and then moved to other kinds of ensembles like dance troupes and circus troupes, and then, of course, got into belly dance and aerobic music. So, but always self-taught, really. Like it's always just kind of like the way I learn things, and I'm doing the same thing now with Celtic music and playing various other instruments besides drums.
Well, tell me about that a little bit more. How are you able to teach yourself and encourage get yourself to explore that which you don't know already? Because it's very easy to keep playing the same, 4 on the floor that you already know. But how do you explore that new genre, that new realm, the new time signature? How do you teach yourself? Like, any strategies that you use to kind of accelerate your learning?
Well, I think I've always had a little bit of an academic and scholarly side. I think I just kind of engage that part of the mind at least part of my mind that likes to engage with books and learn new things. And so as soon as I started on the drum set, I was getting books of like odd time signatures and like how to play in 7/8 and 9/8 and 13/8 and all that. And those were like actually one of the first books I started practicing with. And nowadays there is really a wealth of resources that you can learn from. And I've come across a lot of good instruction in frame drums and good like books and recordings on playing the whistles and other instruments. And that's mainly what I do is just kind of like hit the books every day to some extent and practice and try to learn a new tune or something every day.
And when you're exploring a new time signature, tell me about that, because I imagine for most people that's very difficult to play in some totally foreign time. How do you know when you're doing it right, if you're doing it by yourself, and you're self-taught, like how do you know that you are getting somewhere?
Well, mainly I am always using metronomes or playing along with tracks on my computer and stuff. So there is a kind of a discipline that imposes on your playing, and it's some people prefer playing with other musicians. That is a great thing to do, of course, but it is as you're implying, it's you have to have something you measure yourself against, and need to you got to have something to engage with. And so most of the time when I'm practicing rhythms, I've got metronomes on my phone, and I have a metronome that can play drones on my phone too to practice whistle with. So I know that I'm sort of keeping an even pitch and playing in tune somewhat. And so yeah, like I think for a very long time, I have been pretty much a solitary musician, and my accompaniment is just sort of like my digital backup band, you could call it, and my own tracks on my laptop. And it's, in some ways, it's a peculiar way to go as a musician, but that's just kind of how things have turned out. I'm mainly an electronic solo musician. I don't really play or collaborate with other musicians that much, just to, mostly I do it in terms of remixes or some long distance collaboration with vocalists occasionally.
Yeah, so let's explore your music a little bit more. I know listening to your discography, there's been some evolution for sure.
Yeah.
You discussed long distance. It sounds like you mentioned Celtic music coming through some of your sound. How and why did you start exploring that area of music?
Well, I think that it was mainly that I discovered it by listening to it, and I think there's all kinds of reasons why I made the shift from Arabic fusion and belly dance music, which I did for several years, to Celtic music. I could sort of rattle on forever about cultural authenticity and ancestry and things like that. But I think most of all, like around the summer of 2015, that was a turning point for me when I realized that that's just what I was listening to. Like I was playing at various festivals that summer and playing a set that it was still almost entirely Middle Eastern fusion music, but in my earphones, what I was listening to was Fairport Convention and the Rough Guide to Scottish Folk, and like all I was listening to was like English and Scottish music, and so at that point I realized like I have to do this kind of music. I need to transition into this realm of music.
So once you discovered that, internal disposition, I'll call it, to that music, how did you approach, all right, I want to learn it, I want to create it? Because it's got like such a unique texture and feel to it. How did you start shaping your sound?
Well, I gradually moved from, I think this was sort of like my intention at the beginning. Like I moved as many electronic producers do, like whereas at first you are sort of dependent on samples and you don't really quite understand the inner workings of the music, and you don't play the instruments yet, but there's samples out there. And a lot of my early Celtic tracks, I would just get a good sample of some Celtic melody and then kind of program virtual instruments and beats around that. But I think I knew at the outset that I really wanted to learn to play instruments myself. And so I started picking up the whistle. That's my primary melodic instrument. And all my recent tracks of the past few years, I play the lead melodies on the whistles myself. And also just got into a big phase where I decided I wanted to play real acoustic instruments for the supporting parts. So I got instruments such as a harmonium, like a real harmonium, and a Appalachian dulcimer and an auto harp and melodeon, various other things. And so And so around my current tracks, there might be a couple parts of virtual programmed instruments, but the majority of the parts are instruments that I play myself. So I think I knew that, like, I had to sort of pace myself, and you can't learn one of these instruments in a day. It's a very long process, and especially like the whistles are very different from playing drums, and it's very challenging to me. But I just persist at it because I want to do it. I just want to have something where I can play melodies myself. Like it's really, I feel like it's opened so many doors, and it's sort of made me aware of this whole dimension of music that I wasn't really aware of before because I didn't play a melodic instrument. And when you get into that and really you see, when you start experiencing the melody from the inside of actually playing it on an instrument, it's so illuminating in a lot of ways.
Tell me about it. Like, what's the perspective that you gain from being inside the melody or the creator of it, rather than sampling?
Well, I think when you go through the process of learning to play the melody on an instrument, like, you just automatically, without even trying to learn a bunch of theory or analyze it, you just start to know how the melody works. Like, oh, it goes up to this scale degree and then ascends to that one and then comes back down. And so you just kind of will start intuitively knowing how you're going to harmonize it, and you're going to just intuitively know like what the bass line should be and what kind of rhythm goes with it. And so everything is a lot more to me, the process is a lot more flowing and intuitive now. Whereas when I was doing Arabic fusion, I often found I had to spend a lot of time kind of struggling to get inside the tune or get inside the material and try to understand it. And I always had that just feeling of like I was kind of like this outsider looking in to the music instead of being inside and just naturally flowing with it.
So when you first started recording music into the digital realm, obviously your friend who had that early computer that you mentioned, that might have been the first exposure. But when did you start realizing, and was there any mental breakthroughs when you started to create your own music?
Well, the process of my starting to produce my own music was very gradual. It happened over a few years. And the way that happened was that I was playing in dance ensembles, and at first I was just the drummer, not doing anything electronic, just playing the drums, like drum set and various kind of invented percussion setups of like big sort of tribal drums and things like that. I think because the dance troupe, like with a dance troupe, you are creating a bigger picture, and you're sort of how do I explain it? You're creating something that's more than just music you're supposed to listen to on your earphones or a stereo. It naturally led to me to want to expand the sound palette of what I was doing and create like more of a picture and an ambience and take the audience into this world. This is what you do in a theater performance. You sort of like the lights change and a different world is created with each scene and a different atmosphere. And so I started that way, and just using electronics and various samplers and little groove boxes, which sort of an earlier combo synth drum machine unit, and just adding atmospheres and sounds that I'd use in the theater show. And then from there, I just also was listening to electronic music, really just as a listener, not really thinking of producing it. But I was influenced a lot as a drummer by the rhythms of various genres, like tribal house or drum and bass and things like that. And I would sort of emulate the rhythms of those genres on my drums as best I could. I remember, like in my dance troupe days, I really loved trying to emulate like the speed of drum and bass and play, that.
The speed, is that what you said?
Somewhat in that style on my drum set. But then as things went on, the dance troops that I was involved with, I just sort of took on more of the tasks of musical creation. And in one dance troupe, when I was starting to get into Arabic percussion, I was the only musician. And so it was me and a few dancers and the dance director. And so then that's when I started creating the music and more or less working in my current mode where I would play the lead part on percussion and then I would create the backing tracks for the whole dance group to do their choreography too. And that's really how Drumspyder started. Like my first tracks under the name Drumspyder were around 2005, and the dance group was called the Nikaya. And that's still out there. You can find albums called the Nikaya 1 and 2 on Apple Music and all the other channels. Yeah, the Nikaya is a Greek word meaning the descent into the underworld, and it's part of Homer's Odyssey.
Ooh, that's dark.
Yeah, so it's kind of a descent into the realm of the dead.
Well, let's talk about the rhythm and dive in a little bit, because I listen to your music and I hear very intricate rhythms, really fast sometimes. Tell me about when you are creating rhythms on any kind of percussion instrument that you have. What does your brain think? Do you think in 64s or 128s, or like, how do you start to formulate beats? Do you think in time signature to start and then lock it in, or where do you start?
Well, for a long time, I've been constructing my repertoire of tracks and my live set pretty systematically. Like I start with the tempo of the track, and I've got a list of BPMs and various tempos that go into various parts of the set because I want to play a full range of tempos. Like I've done that for a long time. Like I want to go from 64 BPM right up to 120 or 124 and keep changing the tempo. I think it's intrinsically, like as a drummer, I can't just play at one tempo for the whole night. I need to play a variety of rhythms and tempos. And so the starting point of the track is always that I want to do a track at a certain tempo, and then the next step is picking out the melody that I want to use. It's always a traditional melody which forms the core of the track. And then so when I have the tempo and the melody, then like what kind of rhythm goes with that? What kind of rhythm can I use for that melody at that tempo? And so I am inspired these days by the traditional Irish and Celtic dance rhythms like the reel and the jig and the hornpipe. And formerly, I put a lot of time into learning Arabic rhythms. And so there is definitely a reference to traditional rhythms and the traditional drum patterns that go into folk music. Even though I don't play the bodhrán, the Irish frame drum myself, like I definitely listen to a lot of music with the bodhrán, and so I'm kind of emulating that kind of style to some extent in the rhythms. But so really, I just kind of build from there, and once I have the basic rhythm and tempo of the song, I just kind of start playing on the drums, and I'm not really.
Is this a full kit?
No, I don't play drum set anymore. I only play frame drums and tambourines, which are really just frame drums with jingles on them. And so all of the drums that I actually play are just hand drums. And it's usually once I establish the rhythm and really play around with it and practice it a lot acoustically on the hand drum, like it's only at that point that I would go and program a rhythm on a virtual drum kit with like the kick drum and the clap and those kind of electronic dance music sounds.
So you formulate it with your hands, and then you go in and program it after you've kind of internalized that rhythm.
Yeah.
Wow, that's interesting.
And nowadays, at least, my programming of the beat is also very much based on playing the rhythm by hand. Like I have these sort of virtual frame drum kits in Ableton Live. I play them with a Novation Launchpad controller, which is kind of like simulate to some extent, like sort of like playing a drum kit with your fingers, where you can tap out sounds for different drums, and that helps me a lot to sort of get an intuitive feel, and it sort of feels like playing real drums more than just moving the mouse around and clicking in various beats. Yeah,
for sure. Well, that's a really interesting approach. Grateful that you shared it. I didn't realize that you were formulating it in the way that you did. So that's great. After the tempo, the melody, and the rhythm are lined up, what are some of the go-to sounds or tools to shape sounds that you use in your projects? Like, do you have any go-to VSTs or plugins that you like to use?
Not really. I don't think in terms of effects too much. I keep it very basic and simple. I only use like the internal Ableton effects for the most part. Most of I at least nowadays, I mean, I have to speak in terms of my current process, that is of the past 4 years. I have a strong preference for hitting the real acoustic instruments first before I think about anything electronic. So like I establish the rhythms on the drums and I learn the melody on the whistle, and then I start to play with maybe the harmonium or find the chords on the auto harp, or maybe I might, a lot of my tracks I use the melodeon, or otherwise known as the melodica, on secondary melodic parts or solos. And so I spend a lot of time playing with those before I really get on the computer. And I like that way of working to really get it solidly grounded in the acoustic instruments first. And then when I get to the computer, I use Ableton drum racks. I usually use analog as the bass sound. It's a really nice analog emulation synthesizer that comes with Ableton Live, and I find it pretty smooth and warm, and basically does what I need it to do. I'm not very complicated with bass sounds at all. I really keep it fairly simple. And then I, for the kind of the final layer of, just sort of painting more of a sound picture, I've discovered some virtual instruments that I like a lot, that are emulations of Celtic and medieval instruments, and even some Celtic and sort of medieval and elven sounding voices. And those are all basically from one source, this guy named Eduardo Terralante, who does a number of like great virtual instrument collections on Celtic medieval themes. And I highly recommend those if anyone wants to get that flavor. Nice. in the music. And so when you hear like a harp, like a Celtic harp in my music, or some exotic medieval instrument, or some ambient, it's usually from one of those virtual instrument collections.
So let's talk about a few of your tracks. The first one, Star on the Mountain. I'm wondering, how did you create it? Was there a story behind it? What was the inspiration?
Well, that tune has been one of my favorite medieval tunes just for years and years, and I think I always knew that I'd do my own version of it. It's a medieval pilgrim song from a book called the Livre Femelle de Montserrat, which means the Red Book of Montserrat, a book of music from a medieval monastery in eastern Spain. And it comes in two parts, and so there's the main melodic line, and then there's the counterpoint harmony line, and I play both of those on the whistles, the high D whistle and the low D whistle. And I think I knew I'd do that tune eventually, and I finally got around to it. And on the rest of the track, I was sort of experimenting with, I think, a lot more trance influences than I usually use in my music. I decided, just had the sound in my head of like a synth arpeggio building up and sort of ambient sounds in the background. And so it built up. It's a little bit unusual for my tracks. It's sort of like, it's one of the oldest medieval tunes, but also it has a little bit more of a trancey electronic sound than I usually do. But it was fun. I'm glad that I got my own version of that down.
And when you said it's one of the oldest medieval tunes, tell me about that. What do you mean?
It probably originates in the 1300s, but there's no telling exactly how old it is. Because
is this the melody that you're talking about? The melody?
Yeah.
Okay.
The manuscript is written down, I believe, around 1400. And so that means everything in it must be older than 1400, and it may be a few years or a few, 100 years, who knows, older than that. But I think it probably originates in the 1300s sometime.
Interesting. I did not know that about that track, because there's a few turns in there, and it feels like a journey when you listen to it through.
Cool. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and like all the other tracks, I do add certain melodies to it. There are certain solo parts and harmonic elaborations that I put in there. For all traditional music from the medieval period up to the folk music, the more recent folk music, the written part of it, the traditional written part of it, is only the melody. There's no harmony specified, although this medieval tune is something of exception that it does have two written parts, the upper melody and lower melody and counterpoint. But most, pretty much like 90% of what I do, is the only traditional written source is the one lead melody. So in most, it's standard for like all the Irish folk music and Scottish tunes is just the one lead melody. So what you do with the other instruments and how you elaborate on that is up to you. There's a lot of creative freedom there. And so in all of my recent tracks, it goes into a melodic solo usually, and it just has various harmonies and counterpoints and the bass line that I come up with myself. So I think it is kind of a process where the seed of it and the core of it is always going to be a traditional tune, but then I do the rest, and I think I put in a lot of my own ideas and my own like spirit in elaborating upon that.
So is that the case for all those songs, or at least in the last few EPs, that you are digging up these melodies from hundreds of years ago and kind of using that as a core to build around?
Yes, definitely. Everything from the past 5 years or so is based on some kind of traditional tune. And
are you going to run out of traditional tunes? How many
1,300
tunes are there?
There are thousands of them, and I like right above me, like up here on my bookshelf, I have like a stack of music books that I've just barely scratched the surface of. So I hope people are enjoying folktronica adaptations, because there's a lot more coming.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I appreciate the fact that you are are seemingly like a bookworm. You're going in, you're finding all this historical information, pulling it out, and then using that as structure, but then you get the freedom to work around it, but it still has to complement the core. So it's kind of a nice creative limitation there.
Yes. Well, playing traditional music often there is it's strange. There is a degree of freedom in interpreting the folk music, and that's kind of what's fascinating. I really enjoy the historical continuity of delving into old books and finding like a tune from the 1800s or something that I can use, and often earlier 1700s, 1600s. But then the freedom to elaborate, and I sort of like the fact that mostly the harmonies are not written down. You really just have the melody, and then like you're just kind of on your own as to what to do with it. And I first noticed that when I was in the Arabic fusion world. It's really eye-opening to see, like, you have the music on recordings on one hand. You got some written versions of like old Arabic tunes, or you have these canonical recordings of them, but then you see the musicians who are really good at it, and the way they can just jam it out and improvise on things and go from one tune to another in a really fluid way. And when you see that, you're like, you see a dimension of the music that you might not see just listening to a short recording. You know, when you hear the really good musicians just jamming out and going crazy and just doing one tune and then another, and doing solos and things like that. And I always like inspired by that.
And when you perform live, what do you choose to use on stage?
So far, I only use an electronic drum called the wave drum, made by Korg, as a simulation of frame drum and tambourine sounds that I use at home acoustically. Like when you listen to my recordings, all the drums are acoustic, and they're all like my collection of frame drums and tambourines, but it's fairly difficult to travel with those and to mic them up well in the dance music setting. And so I've settled on the wave drum as a way of simulating those drums, and I've used it for several years. And so far, I've considered adding other instruments, and maybe eventually one of these days I'd like to play the whistle live, to play some live melodies. And I've tried various drum pads and other things to add to the percussion repertoire, but nothing's quite stuck with me. I have a great preference for the acoustic drums and the sort of immediate response you get from the Korg wave drum. It's not that sort of MIDI pad sort of feel where you hit the pad and there's always like a little latency and the drum sound comes out of the computer. I just never quite satisfied with that. It always feels like a little weird and distant. But the wave drum is semi-acoustic, and so you just get this immediate kind of response from the drum head, which is sort of like playing an acoustic drum. So far it's really just like me and the computer and the drum, and that's what's worked for me.
That's great. Does that wave drum have a pickup? Like is it electric in nature as well?
Yeah, it's kind of I'm not technically adept to describe how it works, but there is an acoustic pickup in the head. So if you like scratch the head with your fingers, you hear that scratching noise. Okay. It's really picking up directly from the head, but then it combines that with sampled sounds that are inside the drum, which are based on, it's mainly the sound set that I use is still based on kind of like the Middle Eastern frame drum and tambourines. Like the rick is the Arabic tambourine, and so it got a pretty good rick simulation. It's to my ear, it's definitely not exactly or even too close to what I play acoustically, but it has a realistic enough feel, enough responsiveness, so it just feels like playing a real drum. So it works. Nice. It works well for me.
And I'm sure you've got such a fine ear for rhythm that small latency, 7 millisecond, whatever it is actually noticeable to you. So that must just drive you nuts, like playing and hearing the rhythm just a hair behind.
Yeah, I do. I've always found it, and especially playing live, it's creates this strange kind of distant feeling. So I just kind of decided, at least for now, like the pad drumming, maybe the latency will get down to 2 milliseconds in some future computer or pad setup, and maybe I'll take to it. But so far, I just, it's just not my thing. I think that pad drumming is a little bit of a different art form. Like, I respect people who do like pad drumming really well, and people who simulate full drum kit and everything. It's just, I mean, I've seen videos of some pretty amazing players, but I think the main difference to me in the kind of like the art form of pad drumming with as opposed to the wave drum simulating frame drums is that frame drums tend to be this, basically it's a single drum where you can do a lot of like subtly nuanced things with one drum head. And a lot of the sort of the beauty of frame drum playing is how you can subtly adjust, you can subtly mute different things and play in these continuously different parts of the head and create this sort of fluid range of sound. And pad drums, like, playing live on an Akai sampler, it's more about the discrete sounds. Like, you have one pad playing one sound, another pad plays a different sound. It's a lot more like the drum set in that you've got your snare here and your toms and different toms.
Yeah, you're not going to get two sounds out of one tom.
Yeah, so it's more of an interplay of very distinct sounds that you hit at different times. Whereas I think there's something about frame drum, it's intrinsically more of a single drum thing where it's all about the kind of nuances in playing the same drum but in subtly different positions with these different gradations of sound. So I don't know if that makes sense if you're not.
Oh, it does. And I know I appreciate the hand gestures. For anybody who's just listening, you gotta watch in order to understand. But the hand gestures help me understand and illustrated what you're talking about, being able to change the pitch of a note depending on where you play it in the drum. Obviously the center would be the lowest, towards the frame would be higher. So that's interesting and definitely a nuance there. And then using your other fingers to change the sound of your opposite fingers by muting. So there's a lot going on, that's for sure.
Yeah.
In a short period of time.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to a young musician starting out today?
I would say primarily, I think one of my core values that I would advise a young musician to think about is authenticity and being true to yourself, finding your own voice. And I think that's especially important in the present day of electronic music production, simply because we're in this technological world where any sound and any voice is sort of available to you. You can synthesize any kind of sound. You can sample anything you want. You could, pretty much any style of music you want to create, you could set yourself up with samples and virtual instruments and sort of mimic that. You could be mimicking that style in the same day as long as you had a computer and downloaded the right samples and things like that. And so there is this sort of problem where you just have these infinite options available to you. And I would advise, with all those options in front of you, the most important thing is just really go within yourself and find your own voice. Really think hard about what your own voice is, what you are bringing to the world, what is your history, what is your story, and try to, as much as possible, to like realize that you're navigating this world of infinite options, but what is going to be most important and valuable is for you to stay true to your own voice and got to look at it as sort of like navigating that narrow path and trying to go to where you truly want to go and not getting distracted, because it's like even within part of electronic music production, like let's say like bass sounds, for instance, there's this infinity of bass sounds, and you ask producers like, what do you use for bass? You just get a million different answers of like, oh dude, you got to use this synth and you got to use this effect and you got to do this and that, and you need like 10 layers on top of it and stuff. It's just like you're faced with all these options, but you just have to like sort of, with all that in front of you, like, what sound am I hearing? What is really serving like my music and my voice? What's appropriate to that? And, and also just, think of what picture, another way that I conceptualize this is like, where are you trying to take the listener? Like, what picture are you painting for the listener? Like, are you going into a spaceship? Are you going into a forest? Like the way I think, I'm always trying to sort of some pagan revelry in a forest, like you're dancing around the bonfire or something like that. I mean, it's better than that, really. That's kind of like my first attempt at explaining it, but I have a kind of picture that I want to take, and then that I want to take the listener into, and I'm always thinking about like what sounds really serve to paint this picture, what sounds are really helping to take the listener to that place, and what sounds might be sort of cool and appealing to me, but maybe distracting from the picture or not necessary to the picture. And I would think about those things, like what is taking you to the destination of the track, and what might be distracting you and like somehow just like pulling you off the path to that picture you want to create.
That's excellent. Well, I think you drew at least two great points. And first one, I know we already covered it a little bit, but I want to go back to it because I think there's something special to be said about the going from Arabic dance music to Celtic music. That's a huge transition, and now you are evolving your sound alongside it. So what gave you the confidence to say, hey, this was my sound, and now I'm going to change paths. I'm going to keep the same name, and I'm going to make music that's more, that's deeper felt?
Yeah, well, I did consider changing my name, but I decided, I mean, first of all, there's the kind of business and practical drawbacks of changing your name, and you have to start over again. And I went through plenty of bands where, the band broke up, and then a lot of the same people reformed under another name. And I know from experience how hard it is. It seems like you just kind of have to work your way up again to get people to know who you are. And so there's all that practical sort of promotional stuff. But I think the more important reason why I kept the same name as Drumspyder is that a lot of what I do is still like really exactly the same. Like I play live with the wave drum, and that's what I did. That's what I've been doing really since about 2012. And it's still me. It's still centered around my drumming. So I kind of feel like, I'm still Drumspyder, even though I'm using very different melodies and somewhat different rhythms. And there's also a lot of continuity in that it was back in my Arabic fusion days that I took up frame drums and tambourines, and I have practiced and worked with a lot of techniques they're somewhat adaptable to both realms of music. I play frame drums in a style that is that I would call a sort of cross-cultural modern frame drumming style, pioneered by Glenn Velez, and I've learned most from his approach and the approach of another great frame drummer, David Kukerman, and what probably more directly from David Kukerman's videos is how I learned to play frame drums. and they play in a style with a range of techniques that's drawn from all over the world, really, but through many areas of the Mediterranean and European world. And so frame drumming has become this very encompassing sort of cross-cultural style of drumming. So I feel like a lot of continuity, and like now I listen to Celtic and like Boran playing and Celtic styles of rhythm, and I'm always sort of learning a little more about the feel and the way to accent those rhythms. But then in my drumming technique, there's still just tons of things that I learned from a very cross-cultural sort of pan-Mediterranean style of drumming.
Well, you said something else as well when you were answering the question, what advice would you give? And you're talking about getting to the point, finding the sounds that serve you and avoiding those that don't. Talk a little bit about negative space and what you choose to not put in. How do you know that this sound should go or should not go into the track that you're working on?
Well, I think one stylistic constant, it sort of ties in with transitioning from Arabic to Celtic, is that there's a similarity in most forms of traditional music, and especially the folk music common to the Mediterranean and Europe, is that it's very much like, it's very centered around the single lead melody. And often in the real traditional way of playing, there is no harmony or very little harmony, or there's just a drone in the background. It's very much like a single line style of music. I started to notice that when I was doing Arabic fusion. And I am always thinking of in terms of like, what is the single center of interest that's going on in the music at this time? And I want to be very clear about like what that musical spotlight is shining on, and just let that shine, and then let the other elements support it, but never split the listener's interests or really split the listener's attention too much. Always be clear about like what that central line is, and let everything else support it. And so there in my tracks, there's always a clear, like there's the lead melody part, and then the melodic solo part, and then there's the drum solo part where I played my lead percussion. And I always want to be clear, like which part is which, and not cross over them. I mean, obviously as a drummer, I tend to get a little crazy, and I like to do fills and play like these pretty rapid fire elaborations on the rhythm, but I just try to make that like not interfere with the melody too much, and just keep, always be clear about what the focus is.
That's great. Your analogy made me think of like a photograph, great photo. And if there's something in focus, the rest is not in focus, which brings your attention to it. Obviously a song, it's a moving focus, but it's an interesting concept to keep one thing in focus and make sure everything else supports it. So that's well said. I appreciate that.
Yeah. And the other more practical way of just sort of making sure you're not going overboard. And I think I'm on the extreme end of this, and a lot of producers might totally disagree with this, but I've always just limited the number of tracks that I use. And right now I'm strictly 8 tracks.
Wow.
And of course, some of those are instrument racks, and so there's really more parts folded into that one part. So it's cheating a bit. It's not like strict 8 track, but I always believed in that. I've never used more than 16 tracks, and most of my tracks over the years have been only around 8 tracks, like eight distinct parts. And I think there's something about that where, like, I've heard psychological studies that say that technically, like they test how many elements you can really pay attention to and remember at the same time, and it always comes out to like the human mind can only really deal with like 7 things at a time or something to that effect. I'm not sure exactly how it goes, but there's something about that where like I've always liked I've always liked music from those times when you just didn't have like 72 tracks to play with. Like I love like old rock music recorded on 4-track or 8-track. And I guess, I don't know, maybe I'm just a Gen Xer. I just sort of go back to the 8-track days or something. But, I think it's sort of a compromise really between a lot of electronic music, which is very elaborate and layered, on one hand, versus a lot of the music that I listen to, which is really just like one track. If you think about it, like a lot of the music that I listen to every day is really just like some old folk singer like singing a cappella or singing and playing guitar into one mic. So it's really just like one track music. And so I think my 8 tracks is maybe a little bit of a compromise between very layered electronic music and a lot of the folk and old music that I listen to.
That's great. Outside of music, what are you into? What do you do?
Well, I do visual arts. All the album cover designs of my recent EPs I designed myself. I've started to do paintings a lot more, especially during the past couple of years of staying at home. I've devoted a lot more time to drawing and painting. And besides that, I love reading. I like delving into old books. I'm learning a little bit of Old English, and currently I really am into medieval literature and also various other things, mainly of kind of a pagan nature that I read about.
Interesting. Well, I appreciate you sharing that, and I can see you sitting around like by a candlelight or something, reading these old dusty books and with your flute nearby. So it's fascinating to learn more about you and to learn some of the inspiration behind your songs and the fact that you're pulling these from hundreds of years ago. It always blows me away when I kind of step back and think about recorded music and how brand new it is in the grand scheme of things. We've only got roughly 100 years of recorded music. So everything beyond that is kind of is written down. So we'll never know exactly how it sounded the way that was performed. So for you to kind of revive it, that's cool. It's bringing kind of music out of the dead, maybe Dante's Inferno or something in there. But it's very fascinating.
Yeah, I've always, I think everything I've done, I always am having some kind of conversation with the past or some kind of interaction with the past, and I really love I love the idea of keeping this old music alive and bringing it to a contemporary audience. And sometimes I think about, even when I'm playing in the middle of playing live, I'm playing to this dance floor on an electronic sound system, but then I think about like this tune was written in like 1200 or something. It's a trip, I'm glad to be transmitting this tune, this melody, to this present day group of people and having them dance to it. It's really interesting.
Certainly. Well, if somebody doesn't already know your music or you, what are the best links and places that they could connect to, follow you, keep up to date with your newest releases or tour schedules?
Yeah, well, I am easy to find on all the music channels like Spotify and Apple Music, etc. Just search for Drumspyder, where the spider part is spelled with a Y instead of an I, and that is all one word, Drumspyder. And my website is drumspyder.com. I also keep up a SoundCloud account with everything on it. And on my website, I have the show schedule, and it's posted elsewhere, like on my Facebook page.
Excellent. Well, last questions for you. Is there anything else that you would like to share?
Well, I don't know. Just be true to yourself. Stay strong. I hope everyone's doing great out there. We've had some crazy times, of course, and I know that people want to get out and play and dance again. I hope we're all able to see each other in person. I've had some great recent gigs, and obviously that people are really happy to get out there and dance. And so I hope to just see you out there sooner rather than later.
Excellent. Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time here today, for putting out your music, for making that shift in your personal musical evolution, and explaining to those who didn't know, like myself, that all these tunes are actually coming from hundreds of years ago, and they're being revitalized and brought up from the dead. So that's cool. I really appreciate your music and you sharing some of your techniques and strategies as well. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been great talking to you.
You've been listening to the Freio Music Podcast with Michael Morahan. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. And don't forget to share this podcast everywhere. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay tuned.